Welcome to this live edition of the Educator's Corner podcast with me, Kai Vacher.
And me, Mark Steed.
Great to see you there, Mark. Today's conversation follows Mark and my Reimagining Secondary Schooling event in London in January. And we're looking at what's happened since and what this actually means for hybrid schooling, especially in the Middle East region where I am. I'm here in Oman, given the challenges that they have been facing over the recent weeks. For example, in many parts of the region, many students, teachers and families in the region have been learning fully online because of the regional conflict. It's been a deeply unsettling time, and we want to recognise the resilience and the quiet courage across our school communities. So you might be wondering, why is Kai Vacher, why is Mark Steed, why are they talking about hybrid schooling? What's this all about? What's our interest? So Mark, how did you first get involved in hybrid schooling?
Well, I've had a long-standing interest in how technology can be used in schools. That's been an interest for 20, 30 years now. But I particularly got interested in hybrid back in 2015, 2017, when I did a business master's, and I researched alternative disruptive models for secondary schooling, which was sort of quite prophetic, really, because it was quite handy for when we then came into COVID 3 years later.
Okay, and many listeners, what about me? Well, I think for a start, Mark, I think many listeners will recall a lot of the sharing that you did during the COVID months, because in Hong Kong for quite a lot of the time, you were certainly from a time point of view, you were ahead of the curve in terms of having to deal with the challenges of online learning. And we are very grateful for everything you shared during that time. What about me? Well, as I've said, I'm based here in Oman. I run two schools, one here in Muscat and one 1,000 kilometers down the road in Salalah. And for the last 6 years, and again, I'm sure some listeners will be familiar with the story I've been telling for a while now about how we've been offering and evolving a blended approach to schooling in our Salalah branch from 2020. So we've had 6 years of evolving approach to blended learning, particularly at Key Stage 4 and also Key Stage 5. And then building on that experience in the last year or so, we've actually here in Muscat, where we've got a much bigger school, much bigger sixth form, we've actually introduced online A-level psychology. We introduced that last August to year 12, group of 15 students in year 12 studying that, and that's going well. And we are extending that offer to next year's year 12. So next year we'll have a group of students both in year 13 and in year 12 learning psychology online. So that's a little bit about our backstories and our interest. But I guess just coming back to that point about how much you shared during COVID, I think that's also what we're trying to do with this work. We are trying to surface, to learn, to understand the wealth of practice that is emerging around the world, and actually some of it's been around for quite a few years. We're trying to surface the practice in terms of online and hybrid learning, and trying to learn and understand so we can start to evolve and build on these alternative models that we are seeing emerging already. Okay, so we had this event in London. We had approximately 80 colleagues from around the world turn up, school leaders, entrepreneurs, great thinkers, architects, and we were very grateful for Jessica and Wiles for hosting that event. When you look back at that event, Mark, back in January, what is the one idea that stayed with you most strongly?
Well, I guess the feeling was that very much this was the start of a movement. It was all beginning to happen. That was the sort of feeling of it. But the actual thought takeaway, I think, was captured by Ian Yorston, and I think it's on one of the reels that we put out about the 3 purposes of education. And Ian talks about the need for schools to exist because of childcare, because of socialization, and in order to facilitate learning and the transmission of learning. And his point was that the easiest one of those, effectively, to capture was the learning piece. So that if we design schools and build schools going in the future, we should be doing that around the idea of childcare and socialization rather than learning activities. And I think that's been a really big thought piece for me in terms of how going forward we might look at how we design schools and the emphasis of how we use time in schools and what schools are actually for. So how about you, Kai? What was your big takeaway?
Well, I really like that takeaway. I think that is very provoking, very provocative, because actually it challenges a stereotype about online or hybrid learning, that there isn't that socialization piece. But actually, if you take Ian's argument, it actually creates the opportunity to think about socialization even more creatively than perhaps we do with a traditional bricks and mortar. But I'm sure we're going to come back to that idea. I think the idea that's really stuck with me was very much encapsulated by Selina Boyd, the international editor of the Good Schools Guide, when she said that hybrid is a shift. It's not a trend. So what do I think Selina means by that? I think we are seeing a shift in the way that school is being redesigned. And this is in response to, and we spend a lot of time analyzing this in the publication. And listeners, if you've not downloaded the publication yet, you will see throughout this podcast and at the end opportunities to click on the QR code and download the publication. There it is now. And we did in the publication, the first bit, analyzing quite a lot of depth, using quite a lot of sources and references, why there is this shift in school design. And just for example, some of the factors we are talking about that are driving this shift is the student attendance. You could call it a crisis, where student attendance levels haven't returned yet to what they were pre-COVID. In many parts of the world, including the UK, they're still up in the sort of 20% territory. The level of student engagement, Jenny Anderson has captured this in her book, The Disengaged Teen, where maybe in the upper years of senior schools, very often it's not unusual to have at least 50% of students not engaged in schooling. We have many times already on this podcast, we talked about the teacher recruitment crisis, the increasing cost of education, the changing working patterns in society. I think all these factors, and probably others, the cost of SEN, special needs education, these are all driving and generating a need for other alternative models of schooling. Have I missed anything there, Mark, in terms of those factors driving the shift?
No, I think they're all pulling in. These are all forces on it, and they're all driving the change. So I think that's a really exciting, there's an opportunity here, but as well as a challenge.
Okay. So say if you want to explore those references, and by all means, please download the report, and you'll see our analysis in a lot more depth there.
So Kai, then just moving this on a little bit, what shifted your thinking about hybrid and online schooling? What's moved since that event?
I mean, since that event, and I guess what's been playing out in the parts of the Middle East region over the last few weeks, I think we've seen this again, that online learning still has a bad reputation. So during that event, I think we were really encouraged and energized by the enthusiasm and the dynamism and the creativity that many school leaders and entrepreneurs are putting into designing alternative models of schooling. And in many cases, they're very successful, like Hugh Viney's Minerva Virtual Academy, the fastest growing school in the UK since 2001. We're now over 1,000 students. So there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm and positivity during the event. But then I guess coming out of the event, I'm very quickly reminded, particularly when I see educators, leaders, teachers' responses to going online. It's like, oh no, we're going online again. And parents and families thinking, oh no, we're going online. And I think that online learning, despite the energy and the enthusiasm, which you can see in this shift on the margins of the educational world, at the core of the education world, there are many teachers and leaders and families who still feel that online schooling and maybe hybrid schooling has a really bad reputation. It's not really something that they see in the same light as we see it. How about you, Mark? What's shifted most in your thinking?
Well, I mean, I think you make a really good point. I think there's been a lot of noise around the fact that people have gone on to home learning, and I think that then reflects the fact that when we have these conversations, it casts a shadow over the conversation around hybrid and remote teaching. And I think the point I would make is that hybrid schooling is not the same as home learning. Hybrid is really about how we spend time, whether that's face-to-face in the classroom, whether that's on remote teaching, whether it's individual personalized learning. And these can all be done with students in school all day. It's how, there can be a portion of the day when they're in school having face-to-face teaching. There can be a portion of the day when they're in school being taught remotely. And there can be a portion of the day when they're on individualized, personalized learning. And so going back to Ian Yorston's point about the fact that, what are schools for? Well, I mean, the thing we don't like during remote learning, home learning, is the fact that we don't meet together. We're not meeting face to face. Well, hybrid learning and remote teaching, can all fit together. There will be a component where we're in school doing things in person, and I'm not trying to get rid of that. I think it's a really important thing. So when I'm talking about hybrid schooling, I think when you're talking about hybrid schooling at Salala, we're talking about there is an in-person aspect to it. There is a personalization. There is this social aspect to it as well. So I think there is a bit of confusion, and remote teaching is just one element of that. And I'm sure we'll discuss that a bit more.
Yeah, so I think it is a really powerful point that hybrid schooling does not mean that the students are at home. And so if you take the model in Salala, when we first shared that model, that proposed model with our parents, we only had 5 parents of 5 students in year 9, and they were very keen that we offered something in Key Stage 4, because at that time, back in 2019, we didn't offer anything in Key Stage 4. We couldn't. 5 students, what can you do? But they wanted us to offer something. And so we shared with them this blended model, which was basically a third face-to-face teaching, a third online teaching, and a third independent study. And the key question those parents wanted answered was, are our children going to be in school? And so throughout our 6-year experience in Salala, apart from when the school was not open because of COVID, like schools all over the world when we first started the model, incidentally, but since 2021, the blended provision, the hybrid model we've been offering in Salala, those students have been in school all the time. And we've worked with slightly different variations of the model, but in essence, it's still roughly about a third of the learning is face-to-face, a third of it is online, but the children are in classrooms in the school and a teacher's beaming into those classrooms, and about a third of it's independent study. And so we have to be careful. I think that when we hear the word hybrid, that doesn't mean that it's at home learning. It could be at home learning for some students for some of the time, but it can also mean that for quite a lot of students, they're in school all the time. Mark, was there anything else you wanted to add to that key thought?
No, and I think the key thing here is that remote teaching in the context of a sort of emergency situation, whether that's COVID or whether the situation we've recently had, period of home learning during, in the Middle East during this recent conflict, is very different from planned and measured remote teaching. I mean, when you look at the work that the online schools are doing, where they've got the structures in place, and the technical structures in place, and the right tools to be able to deliver remote teaching, it becomes a very different thing from a teacher being thrown into that mix in a crisis situation.
Okay.
Most teachers aren't ready for it.
Okay, so let's try and move this forward a little bit. So if we are to stop treating online learning or hybrid as an emergency fix, and we're going to try and shake off this negative reputation that online and hybrid has got, what do you think, Mark, is the single most important change we need in teacher training and professional development? What do we need to do differently?
I think there are two aspects to it. The first is, I think we need to have much better training around remote teaching pedagogy. I think we need to recognize that it is a different skill set from teaching in a classroom. Classroom management is very different in an online context, as we all know. But so there's that pedagogical training aspect, but there's also, I think, it's about the use of sophisticated sort of learning platforms and training in how we use those as well. I mean, if you watch a experienced educator teaching remotely in an online school, you will see them. They've got access to tools that allow them to engage individually with the students. They use a lot of polling through the lessons to check learning, and then can follow up individually on the chat with each student. So it's that ability to get the interaction in a different way. Now that's a different pedagogy. You do it with question and answer, and you do it by moving around the class physically when you're teaching in a normal context. And here in a remote, online sort of remote teaching context, you have to use different tools. So you've got to have the platform and you've got to have the training. I mean, does that chime with what you're doing in terms of your remote teaching at Muscat and Salala?
Absolutely, Mark. I think I think the biggest challenge on reflection on the London event, the biggest challenge to extending hybrid and online learning, particularly hybrid, into the mainstream, I think the biggest challenge is how we get more leaders and more educators to think positively about online pedagogy. And then I think, if I were to ask any teacher or leader, how much training have you had as a teacher, or how much training have you given your staff in the last couple of years on online pedagogy? I'm sure the answer from many of us would be not very much or zero. And it is a different way of teaching. I mean, it's still teaching and it's still learning, but it is a different medium. And I think one of the biggest things we need to do, and you've started to articulate how that might happen, is in teacher training. And I know Paul Glossop from the University of Derby. Hope you're listening, Paul, and you're out there. I know you've been doing a lot of work on this, University of Derby, Paul Glossop. But teacher training, we need to build in online pedagogy as an integral part of teacher training. And then in our own schools, I think we need to build in on a regular basis, at least once a year, like we do with safeguarding training. We need to build in online pedagogy training, because there's no doubt that while there's still online learning still got a bad reputation, there's no doubt, and I think you can see this across the region over the last couple of months, the online teaching and the online learning, which was taking place and has been taking place in the last few months, in many, many cases has been a much higher level, a much better level than it was 5 or 6 years ago during COVID. Right, well, as we start to look to the future, we're going to take a break there, and we'll see you back shortly.
It's moving towards having reduced barriers.
Flexibility.
Choice. Curiosity. Flexibility becomes a huge factor, because then you can learn, what you want to learn, when you want to learn it, where you want to learn it, how you want to learn it.
Just a quick pause in the conversation. If you're finding this episode useful, it would mean a great deal if you could hit the subscribe or follow button wherever you're listening. It helps more educators discover these conversations and tells us to keep creating them. So, if you haven't already, take a moment now to subscribe to the show. Let's get straight back into the discussion. Okay, welcome back to this live edition of the Educator's Corner with me, Kai Vacher.
And me, Mark Steed.
Okay, so we had quite a bit of reflection there in that first section. Let's now talk about what this means for school leaders now and how we could be thinking about this in the next few years. Mark, what do you think is one practical step a school leader could take in the next 12 months to move towards, or at least in the direction of, a more genuinely hybrid model?
I think you've started articulating it anyway, Kai, and I think it is around training, and partly around mindset as well. I think teachers need to see this as one of the skills that they should be developing in their toolkit, and because I think remote teaching is going to become an increasingly important part of education as time goes on. And so those people who have developed skills in it, I think, are going to be very, very high value teachers going forward. And we've seen this in the tutoring industry. Years ago, I remember talking about the millionaire teachers, the tutors in the Far East who had got massive followings around their tutoring program, and online tutoring, because they were just very, very dynamic. And I think that this is going to develop into, who are the very best online teachers, and there will be really detailed careers for them, and very well remunerated careers for very strong online teachers.
Okay.
What about you, Kai? Where are you with all this?
Well, I think as I was alluding to just before the break, when I think about how much training have I offered to my colleagues in the last couple of years in online pedagogy, I think very, very limited, very limited. We've certainly got very clear protocols and systems and procedures, but in terms of pedagogical training, probably very limited. And what's certainly happening in this part of the world now, and in Oman specifically, is it doesn't rain very often, and it's very unpredictable. And when it does rain, it rains incredibly heavily, and it's very dangerous, very dangerous. And so when there's the threat of rain, the authorities here they do get quite worried about pupil safety, Oman's safety, people's safety, and so now they know that schools can switch to online in the last few years, that they are more ready to announce school closures. So we do get at least once or twice a year, we get school closures because of the threat of rain. And then actually just before the spring break, we had 3 weeks, a whole week of rain, and we were closed for 3 days. And so it's probably pretty likely now, certainly in Oman, that as an international school or any school here, there's a good chance we're going to be closed for online learning at least once a year. And if we know that's going to happen, then I think it is really important that not only can we make that switch very easily in terms of processes and procedures, but in terms of being skilled, as skilled as our staff are to teach a face-to-face lesson, we need to make sure that we are putting training in at least once a year, so our colleagues feel really confident that when we're going online and we're teaching online, that we've got really up-to-date training, and we're not only familiar, say, with the process and procedures, we're also really comfortable with engaging in effective pedagogy. So that's certainly one thing I'll be looking into bringing in this August, is in our inset program, actually bringing in some online pedagogy training into those 5 days in August.
I mean, I think there's real potential in all sorts of areas here. I mean, if you're running a schools group, for example, and we're moving into groups, then how you provide cover across the group, isn't necessarily going to be in person. So, I can see a situation in a couple of years' time where a schools group has effectively a team of people who can step in and provide online cover, remote teaching cover in situations where a teacher's away for whatever, a medical emergency or whatever. And having that ability to provide that, and indeed the online schools are now providing maternity cover for the mainstream bricks and mortar schools. So we're seeing a greater openness to remote teaching, innovative solutions in order to solve a short-term crisis problem, whether that's a maternity cover in a specialist subject. And I think the other part of this is we've got to think, well, how do we want our teachers to spend their time? And if I've got a physics teacher who is a really skilled physics teacher, then I really want them to focus on teaching physics. And how can I flex across a group that ability? If I've got a super physics teacher, can they flex into supporting the teaching and learning in other schools? Yes, the answer is yes, they can. They could be taking extension classes in other schools within the group, in the way that I think you share some of your staffing between your two schools as well. So I think we're going to see new models. I mean, and you're slightly at the cutting edge of this stuff with what you're doing around your psychology at Muscat, aren't you?
Well, perhaps we are. I mean, I think all we're doing is using the available solutions to create opportunities for students which wouldn't exist if we didn't engage with those existing technologies. So it doesn't feel particularly innovative at times. I mean, we've just recruited our psychology teacher to teach online next year. And one of the really simple things you might think this is really obvious, but one of the things that we've learned is we've actually recruited somebody who is going to be east of us all next year. And that simple practicality that she's going to be east of us means that it's probably easier to engage online with us when you're east of a school than when you're west of a school. Because if you start at 7:30 in the morning and you're west of that school, it means you're going to have to get up very, very early in the morning. If you're still teaching at a school and you're east, even if it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it might only be early evening if you're east. So we were really pleased, actually, that this teacher she's going to be east. And I think what's really interesting, and I do get frustrated when you hear of maybe unions in parts of, let's say, the UK blocking schools that are trying to employ online teachers. Because from a teacher's point of view, this teacher next year, she's going to be traveling around Southeast Asia for a whole year with her young family. And at the same time, she's going to be teaching basically 0.5 part-time at our school. So she has the wonderful opportunity to travel with her family while also maintaining a professional interest as a teacher, as a psychology teacher. And she's able to do that because we're offering this additional opportunity to our students online. So it's a big win for that teacher, it's a big win for her family, and it's a big win for our students. So I'm sorry, but I struggle to see why extending opportunity for young people in that way and creating a flexible teaching opportunity for a teacher and their family, that seems win-win-win. I don't know what your thoughts are. Am I being naive?
No, I think it's great. I mean, I'm minded of the tutorial colleges that are running, sort of there are tutorial companies based in London who basically do after school in Hong Kong in the morning. They do after school in the Middle East around lunchtime, and they do after school in the UK live. So I mean, that time zone point is well made. I think it's a rather good one. But they're obviously working after school, hence being west of it is more use. But I think also we're going to attract better talent because we're going to have these people who want to do other stuff. We've talked often about the Gen Z teacher who wants to be able to go to Glastonbury and still teach, sort of type thing. And I think we are going to have to come up with more flexible teaching contracts in order, employment contracts for people in order to attract talent into teaching, particularly in difficult specialist subjects. And I would include psychology in that. So yeah, these are interesting things. And I've always liked the idea that you fly the teachers out to meet the students first, don't you? And you do that aspect as well. And I think that's always been a very strong part of what you've done at Muscat, to actually get to know the class in person, this idea of grounding the class, in a human relationship before then working remotely. And I think there's a lot in that. And that's, again, why I come back to hybrid over a wholly online school, because I think that human contact becomes very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the teacher we've had with our year 12 group this year, she came out for 2 weeks in August, September to get to know that group face to face. Then she came out again in January or February for another week. And now she's actually been with us for the last 2 weeks, not just at the start, but also at the end, when you get to that really crucial point where the children are really trying to sort of cram for the end of year 12 exam situation. And so she's been with us here for 2 weeks. And the students have been telling us for the last 2 weeks how much value they've seen in that too. So yeah, even with our online psychology, it's actually hybrid, because by the end of this year, our psychology teachers this year will probably have been in school for at least 5 or 6 weeks. Okay. So I know we've got lots of questions coming in, so I want to give some space for us to answer those questions. But my final question before we go into our listeners' questions today, Mark. My final question to you would be, and you've already started to do this a little bit in terms of looking 5 years ahead to the school group, but looking 5 years ahead, what worries you most if we don't act, and what gives you most hope that we will act?
Well, look, this isn't a burning platform. We don't have to do this now. I mean, occasionally, obviously, we have to flex into it as we've recently done in the Middle East. But if we're talking about truly hybrid schools, as in the combination of bricks and mortar and online and personal learning, I think that we should start looking at it, because the challenges are only going to get worse. Teacher recruitment, the cost of education, changing working patterns, these are not going away as issues. So I think it's prudent for people to explore new opportunities, to explore new models. If I were running a schools group, I would certainly want to have quite a significant portion of my research and development budget in getting this right, because I'm sure it's going to be part of a schools group mix down the line, where there are going to be hybrid offerings in the way that Duke's are doing in London, where Duke's have got they've got the mainstream school, but they've also got a hybrid offering tagged on to that school. And I think it makes sense for any schools group to do that, because you've got resources and you could make more of it. You can have more students by going hybrid. And I think so. I think getting working on the sort of projects we're working on here, Kai, like, what does good remote teaching pedagogy look like? What does a hybrid school physically look like? How do we design them? These are good questions for schools and schools groups, particularly forward-thinking ones, to be working on at this time, with a view to it becoming much more mainstream, probably on a 5 to 10 year horizon.
Okay, so I think I would echo that. If I was asking myself that question, what gives me most hope that we will act? I think there are an increasing number of educators, leaders, entrepreneurs who see that by developing, like you say, really good online pedagogy, thinking about hybrid design. And again, you can see an example of a hybrid school design in the publication. Jessica and Wiles are partners for that first conference back in January. They spent a considerable amount of creative time and energy producing some prototype designs of what a hybrid school could look like. So I would really encourage listeners to engage with those designs in the publication, and it will give you food for thought. But I think at the moment we have a real opportunity to evolve new shapes of schooling that could start to address some of these really tough problems we've got around attendance, around student engagement, around teacher recruitment, around the cost of education, around special needs provision. There are some really serious challenges, and I think hybrid, designed creatively, designed with really quality online pedagogy as part of the offer, has probably a better chance, because they're more flexible, has a better chance of addressing some of these problems that many schools around the world are trying to deal with. And I am continually excited by every week somebody else contacts me from some part of the world, say, well, I'm doing this in the online space, so I'm doing this in the hybrid space. And there's some incredible stories that are starting to surface of what is actually possible when you start being creative with online pedagogy as part of the school design. So we've got lots of questions coming in. So we're just going to take a quick break there, Mark, and we'll come back after break and we'll start getting into your questions that you're sending in. And please keep sending them in. I know there's a lot coming in, but we really want to get engaged with some debate here. Okay, let's take a break there.
Hi, my name's Ian Yorston. People often forget that schools provide three key things. One is childcare, literally childcare. Parents just want to drop their children off so that they can go to work. Secondly, you're wanting to provide socialisation skills. You want children to spend time with other children, which they can do digitally, but they probably do better one-to-one. And then the third thing is the academics. And people tend to focus on the academics, but actually it's the least difficult bit of the problem. That's the one bit that can be done online, can be done asynchronously, can be done using technology. I'm sure you probably need teachers to keep an eye on what's going on and to provide enthusiasm. That's the delight of hybrid education, is saying we don't have to devise our school around the idea of academics. We can devise our school around the idea of childcare, socialisation, and then worry about the academics using more modern technologies. I think the really exciting bit is the idea that bricks and mortar schools can provide childcare, socialisation, but they don't have to be wedded to the classroom. One of the great things is we're here in an architectural firm for the day. And from an architectural perspective, schools are looking at the idea that maybe they need fewer classrooms. You need perhaps more lecture spaces because you can bring amazing lecturers into your school, either virtually or in real life. But then you perhaps need one-to-one spaces or one-to-two spaces. But perhaps the one thing you don't need is a classroom that's holding 24 students. If we could somehow figure out how to make more students, particularly teenagers, more curious, so that education is something that they see something to reach for rather than something that's pushed at them. We want to turn education from a traditional push model to a much more interesting pull model. And I think that is becoming more possible. Historically, it relied on really inspiring teachers to make it happen. But you can sort of capture really inspiring teaching using all these technologies. And once children are curious, then I think flexibility becomes a huge factor, because then you can learn what you learn, what you want to learn, when you want to learn it, where you want to learn it, how you want to learn it, and it should be possible to do that. And my guess listening to today is that's going to happen faster than many people would have expected.
Welcome back to this live edition of the Educator's Corner podcast with me, Kai Vacher.
And me, Mark Steed.
Right. Well, thank you so much for the questions coming in. And you can see we've got a first question there from Trevor Rowell, previously a head teacher of several international schools around the world, and then more recently, chair of COBIS. Just before we go to Trevor's question, and I'm going to give you a chance to process that one, Mark, I'm going to ask you that in a moment. A couple of things to remind our listeners. First of all, please download the publication if you haven't done already. It's absolutely free. It's full of interesting information from that conference we did in January earlier this year. There's lots of references in there. So please download the Reimagining Secondary School 2026 report. That's one call to action. The second is that we're going to have a second conference in January, 19th of January 2027. We're really grateful for Pearson. They have offered their conference space on the Strand in central London, Tuesday the 19th of January. That's the day before the BET show. I know many of you will be in London for BET, so please join us at that event, and we'll be sending out details for that also. So let's take the first question, if we could maybe have that back on the screen so we can see that from Trevor Rowell. There's a strong element of hybrid learning in higher education, which is now accepted, unlike in schooling. Is there anything that we can learn from higher education, Mark?
Yes, I think there is, and I think it's an interesting approach. I think there's a good and bad about the way HE are using hybrid. I think the fact that there's a negative aspect to the way HE are using hybrid, in that students don't need to go to lectures anymore. They're becoming more isolated because they're not having to physically meet together. So I think one of the lessons that we need to learn from the HE use of hybrid learning is that they actually need to create opportunities we need to have students coming together to learn together as part of the equation. And I'm sure that still is part of the equation in HE, but I know that there are big aspects of it that aren't. I'm not sure HE's really got the sophistication of something like the online schools in terms of remote teaching. I mean, when you watch a skilled online teacher working in an online school, working on a specialist platform that's designed for it, where there is constant synchronous interaction, that's very, very different from what's happening in HE. So I think it's probably HE's got more to learn from the online schools than the other way around. How about you, Kai? What's your thoughts?
My thought from that is, I've been talking about this with a few people recently, is if you think of the sort of traditional Oxbridge model of learning. I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. I know that you did, Mark, but I didn't have that opportunity. But the traditional university model is where you'd have a lecture of several hundred students, and then you'd have several of those a week, and then you'd have at least one or two tutorials in a much smaller group, maybe 5 or 6 students, where you'd have really, really fantastic discussion. And I wonder if that model, that could form the basis for a hybrid school design, where you could have, like the Joe Wicks approach to teaching and learning, you could have 20, 30,000 students engaging with an online lecture. I mean, there's no limit now to how many students could engage with an online learning lecture. But then in your hybrid school, you would provide the space for teachers and coaches to be working with much smaller groups, so they engage with that content, and you challenge them with that content, and you explore that content with them in a much smaller group setting. So, yep, I think HE might not have it right, but there is a lot we can learn from them. But also, there's an interesting bit of research just a couple of years ago where McKinsey, I think they talked to about 20,000 19-year-olds right across the world. And at least 60% of those 20,000 19-year-olds who had just come out of COVID, they wanted online learning to be part of their higher education study. So it's probably about quality. It's not that students don't want it at higher education. I think it's the way in which it's done, which maybe not every HE institution's getting quite right at the moment. Okay, have we got another question coming in? I hear there's a lot of questions going in. Here it comes. Simon Luxford-Moore. And thank you, Trevor, for that question. Now over to Simon Luxford-Moore. So would you say this approach to online classes with senior students could be successful? Mark.
Okay, I think what Simon's alluding to here is, does this work for different ages? And I think that the experience that people are finding is that the older the student, the more self-motivated the student, the better the situation. That said, I think some of the online schools are going down to year 7 very successfully. I think it's also tied in with what are the optimum class sizes at each age group as well. There's an argument that says you could probably cope with a bigger class size with an older group because they're more skillful and more engaged on their own, whereas they perhaps need to be the other way around. So in other words, slightly flipped from what we do in bricks and mortar schools at the moment. But yeah, look, these are all interesting questions, and in terms of, and I think we're finding our way as more and more online teaching is happening. We're finding out what works and what doesn't. But yeah, I mean, Kai and I have quite an interesting debate about how many people what's the optimum class size, and whether it's 12 on a screen because it's 4:3 on a screen, and that's quite a decent thing, or whether you could go up to a bigger class than that, or whether you should only have 9 on the screen, 8 plus a teacher or whatever, because you can engage students more. I know Minerva are running GCSE and A-level classes with 20 students on the screen very successfully. So I think it does rely on the technology behind it to be able to, in effect, follow up on a personal level to have a bigger class size. But I think, yes, I think online teaching generally works better with older students. I mean, if you go for the reductio ad absurdum thing, you know, it's not going to work with a 5-year-old. It's going to work with an 18-year-old better.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that so far with our experience. I mean, you know, we've decided to introduce A-level online psychology or online A-level psychology. I think it's an easier place to start. But in Salalah, our school down in Salalah, we've got Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. I think it's more challenging with our existing online pedagogical approach at the moment. It's easier with Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, maybe more challenging with Key Stage 3. But I think King's Inter High, I think if Rufus Saunders is listening in, which I no doubt he will be, Rufus from King's Inter High, he would say that I think they offer King's Inter High down to as far as year 6, or even if year 5 at the moment. So it's not impossible. And I was hearing of some incredible redesigning of schooling of primary or elementary education in South Africa. There's a group of schools that's growing in South Africa at the moment, led by a female entrepreneur. I'm very sorry your name escapes me. I'd love you to get back in contact. And Sue Aspinall, I know, has also been challenging me when we're saying this is about reimagining secondary schooling. Sue thinks there are also some really good examples of reimagining primary education, which involves some form of online or hybrid approach. So please, we would love to extend this to reimagining education 3 to 18. So if you do know of, or you're part of an approach at primary level or elementary level that's being really innovative and take a different approach and using online or hybrid in some form, please contact us. And Mark and I are both fairly active and contactable on LinkedIn. Okay, on to the third question. Here it comes from Christina Astin. I think Christina's quite active in the HMC network. I definitely recognise Christina's name from 1 or 2 HMC conferences in the past. Do you think that the bad rep for online teaching and learning relates to the difficulty of peer interaction, which we know is crucial to learning? Mark, over to you.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I agree totally that peer interaction is difficult, because I mean, it's quite easy to set up breakout groups and breakout rooms and allow students to discuss a topic with each other in the way that you would perhaps divide students up in a class, and a particular table might discuss a topic. So I think this comes down to pedagogy and having access to different technologies. So if you've got a technology that allows you to use a discussion group and you are skilled in setting those up and using them, then you do get the peer interaction. I think where online and remote teaching is more difficult is that teachers are incredibly good at using body language to control classes just by a look or a moving around the class and so on, and to keeping people on task. And there's a sense in which that's more difficult online. You just have to monitor students, but it is possible when you've got a classroom that might be divided into 4 groups, for a teacher to have a sort of soft monitoring, if you like, of all 4 groups at the same time. That is much more difficult in an online context. So I think it comes down to skills of the teacher. It does come down to that. But I think one of the interesting things is that, Minerva, which I'm, sort of on the advisory board for, they've actually started getting students together as well. So they're recognizing that, they have these school trips and so on, so that students do interact with each other. So there is peer interaction there. So, and I'd be interested to know if that then has a better impact on lessons, if they've met each other and know each other from outside school. What about you, Kai? How are you playing this?
I think on the one hand, it partly comes back to your point that online teacher learning does not have to happen outside of a school context. So our online psychology A-level is happening in school. So there's no change to peer interaction really in that setting. So I guess that's one piece. And again, homeschooling also similarly sometimes gets a bad rep on social interaction. But if you actually look at the reality of homeschooling for many, many children, they are part of incredibly rich and dynamic social networks that do meet face-to-face on a very regular basis. So just because you're not in school all the time doesn't mean that you're not getting the peer interaction, which is so important. But also, you were talking earlier, Mark, about Minerva's learning platform and how that not only now allows much easier peer interaction, and certainly in the last few weeks when we've been online for bad weather, it's now a lot easier to do breakout groups than it was during COVID. But also the Minerva platform allows, you were explaining to me how that allows for much easier individual teacher-student interaction, which certainly wasn't happening 5 or 6 years ago on a typical, let's say, Google or Teams platform. Okay, let's go with the next question. I believe we've got another question coming in. Here it is from Peter Darby Crook. Peter was head of British School Muscat many, many years ago. He's been head of probably nearly every international school around the world, or many international schools around the world. Great to have your question in, Peter. Thank you. The traditional secondary model is long overdue for a complete review. What are we trying to do? Why do we teach in subjects? Why are schools closed for half a year? We need more flexibility. So that sounds like a statement as well as a question. What are we trying to do, Mark? Maybe to speak to that question, what are we trying to do?
I think the elephant in the room here is the fact that we're working within a very obsolete examination and assessment framework. So, which, we're all heading into a period of exams now at a set period of time. I'm a great advocate of just-in-time, assessment and certification. Why do we have cohorts going through at the same time? This is a much bigger discussion than hybrid. But I think once you get into discussing disruptive education and alternative models, you eventually bump up against the fact that this is the control on education globally is by examination structures, and the idea of putting students into cohorts who then have to sit exams at a set time and we therefore assess them in discrete subjects because that's how we teach them. And all of those, as Peter rightly points out, are actually very false sort of constraints. If we want to have learning, then it can be cross-curricular. It could be assessed in a different way. It could be assessed on demand at the right time, in the way that we sit music exams or take our driving test when we're ready to do it, regardless of age. It's, am I up to it for that thing? But this is a much bigger debate. But I do agree with you with your statement at the end, Peter. We do need more flexibility.
And hybrid schooling creates more flexibility for learners and more flexibility for teachers and people who work in schools. And I think maybe that's the final point that I'm going to leave with, because we're out of time. But I think for me that's a really important concluding point, that if we want to create more flexibility for young people and address many of these challenges that we're faced with, and we want to create more flexible working options for our staff, we need more flexible models of schooling, and hybrid creates those more flexible models of schooling. So that'd be my end thought. Mark, how would you like to wrap up?
I think that this is a debate that we are right in the thick of at the moment. I know the Reimagining Secondary Schooling conference in January next year, we're going to focus on pedagogy as a thing. We're going to try and do a much deeper dive into that. We're going to try and get examples of that, people doing demonstrations of what online pedagogy looks like. And that's going to be our focus. So I'm really looking forward to having remote teaching experts and practitioners being, leading that conversation. So that's really going to be our theme for that conference next January. So do join us for that. And if you want to learn about that sort of thing, or if you want to indeed to be part of the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So we will be in London on the 19th of January. We'll be pushing out details about that event next January, the day before BET. If you've not downloaded the publication yet, please download the publication, take a dive into it. There's the QR code on the screen. Check out the Secondary School, Reimagining Secondary School Report 2026. Lots of ideas and thoughts to reflect on there. Tune in to the Educators podcast and subscribe to KaiPod News, where you can stay up to date with our work in this space. And please contact us on LinkedIn. I'm very sorry if we've not been able to answer your question today. If there's interest and demand, we'll certainly think about repeating a live Educators Corner podcast sometime between now and January. But thank you for joining us today from all around the world. Thank you for your questions and your engagement. I understand there's been some incredible conversations going on in the chat. So let's keep the conversation going. And thank you, Mark, for joining us today from the UK. And thank you to our wonderful production team, who you can't see, but Communicating for Impact. They have been supporting this event and producing it. So Laura Wilkes and Haven, thank you to you. And thank you to Lauren Martin, who's helped us put together the report, which you can download for free. Okay, have a great rest of the day. Thank you for joining us. And this, if you didn't manage to get all of the live event, we will be editing this and pushing this out as episode 30 of the Educators Corner podcast. And you can find us on YouTube and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks ever so.
Thank you for listening to the Educators Corner podcast, a BSM BSS production. This episode was produced by Laura Wilkes with post-production by her team at Communicating for Impact. If you'd like to go beyond the corner and explore the ideas from today's episode more deeply, subscribe to KaiPod News, the newsletter for curious educators. let's keep this conversation going between the podcast episodes.